on the show today, Petri Berndtson. So he is a philosopher of breathing. Have I got that right, sir?
Yes, you have got that extremely well. Philosopher of breathing, that's how I would describe myself.
So cool, so cool. Okay, and where are you in the world?
I'm in Finland at the moment, and it's a small place called Haapavesi. I live in Helsinki, but now I have been staying 500 kilometers north of Helsinki, enjoying the summer here in Haapavesi.
Well, I like Finland very much. I taught there once by a frozen lake in the middle of winter, and it was wonderful. I have a Finnish student who I'm very fond of, and she's remarkably weird in a very lovely way, and she tells me that's typical. So I'm looking forward to this, Petri.
Well, when you said you were next to a lake, I am now staying 1 minute walk away from the lake. I have just today swam 2 times already.
Jumping in the lake. Okay, good. Okay, how did you get interested in the breath, Petri? How did that happen?
Well, many years ago, when I was thinking in philosophy, I was studying theoretical philosophy in University of Helsinki, and I was thinking what will be my master thesis theme. And I was practicing a lot of singing, and I was thinking that is it possible to make a philosophical thesis, your master thesis on singing. And then I was talking with a philosopher very important to me, a phenomenologist, Juha Varto, and I asked him, like, what does he think about if I would do a phenomenological study of singing? And he said that it's a pretty cool idea, but breathing could be even more interesting because it's connected to singing, but it is connected so much to more, and it's kind of like the ground of our being, if we could see it. So there it started. Then I did my master thesis on breathing, and in the final moments of my master thesis, I started to understand that I have some insights that I have never seen anybody, at least in the written form anywhere, put in books or articles. They didn't come to my master thesis, but that gave me the idea of I need to do a PhD on this, and then that started the whole journey of doing a PhD. And then my dissertation was finalized in 2018, and so that's one of the first philosophical PhD dissertations on breathing, and actually the first one on phenomenological ontology.
Okay, I know those word means, but we'll break those down as much as anyone does. For listeners in a little bit, we'll come back to phenomenology and ontology. So this is actually really interesting. On the one hand, our whole language is full of, in many languages, the breath of life, or God breathed life into, Adam or the soil or whatever. This idea that breath is really central to who we are, and it's central to almost every embodiment practice. There are a few that's not, but most would say, yoga, martial arts, dance, so many of them would say the breath is the center of the practice, and breath work has become very popular in modern times. And yet, in philosophy, I've almost never heard it mentioned. In more academic, more kind of literate kind of circles. A little bit on the body, a little bit on experience, but almost nothing on the breath. So how has this happened that our intellectual class has somehow missed the thing that's most essential for our survival, most primary to our being, and has been part of spiritual and psychological practice through thousands of years? How has that happened that you're one of the first to do this? That is madness.
It is very, very strange and also very interesting. How would one kind of come in terms with this very weird situation? I would say that there are quite few reasons for this. First of all, already in ancient philosophy, in ancient Greece, the words that meant breath, especially psyche, which means originally breath, and then only in the secondary sense, in the etymological sense, it means breath, and then it started to mean soul or mind or spirit or this kind of stuff. And this happened already in Plato's works. He interpreted the psyche in the first sense in the rational manner and something connected to our thinking and to the theory of the ideas and stuff like this. Because before Plato, some of the Greek pre-Socratic philosophers, they were thinking of the breath. For example, Anaximenes, who saw that the breath, he connected breath with the soul and with air. So there is these kind of roots, but it got completely forgotten through so many different reasons. And one of the reasons, I have not myself studied so deeply this question of what's the history of this forgetting of breathing in Western philosophy. But Plato, how after Plato and through Plato, the psyche, which originally meant breath, was forgotten, and it got this kind of rational meaning, and meaning which meant thinking. And then I would say also in the Cartesian philosophy, Descartes, when he split human being in half to the body as a substance and a soul as another substance, and then breath was understood to be part of the body, which would mean then that it is some kind of, which then through the sciences and through this kind of mechanistic worldview, it was started to understand that breath is some kind of a materialistic, mechanistic process of only like a physiological survival, which doesn't have any kind of connection to human thinking or human experience or philosophical life or wisdom and so on. So how this question that you made to me is actually so deep.
And it's big, isn't it? And if I may interrupt a little bit here, it strikes me that it's very inconvenient for someone like Descartes. I think always gets slightly a bad name in embodiment circles, somewhat unfairly, I would say, but it's very inconvenient if we say, breath is the joining point of body and mind, it's the interface of body and mind, it's how one impacts one from the other. Now that's a little bit inconvenient to someone who's splitting those two worlds apart, that there's this thing that's very obviously a bridge in the, if you're stressed, your breath changes and you can change your breath, be less stressed, right? Let's just use that as an example. Is that body, is it mind? Well, it's both, clearly. So I can see where that might have been a bit taken out of the picture as sort of not really one or the other.
And Descartes has in his metaphysical papers on first philosophy, his book where he has this very important description where he says that how he can withdraw himself into the thinking self or the thinking thing to his consciousness or to his soul is that he withdraws from all senses. And he says that he closes his eyes and he puts something in his ears that he doesn't, and then he withdraws after that from all the other senses. And in our book, also in 2018 came out the first ontology on philosophy of breathing, which I edited with the Slovenian philosopher Leonard Skoff, who is another philosopher of breathing. So in our introduction to this book, we were taking this Descartes' description, and then we were saying and writing that Descartes, when he says that he withdraws from all senses, and that's how he becomes familiar with his inner self, which is the soul, which is somehow immaterial and withdrawn from the physical world, that this is some kind of like the culmination point of like how Western philosophy truly starts to think that the body is not something that is a source of wisdom. And then what we say in this introduction is that actually Descartes is making a totally fictitious description, because when he says that he withdraws from all the senses, that means that he also closes his nose, that he doesn't smell anything, and he closes his mouth, that he doesn't taste anything. And then through this kind of process, he says that he'll find some kind of real inner self or some kind of immaterial soul. But if he would, and then he starts to think rational ideas and questions of philosophy. But if he would have been truly truthful in his description, the first thing that would have happened would have been total panic and anxiousness and dreadful experience of I can't breathe, I need air. And then if he would have taken truthfully this what he said he was gonna doing, our philosophical tradition in the modern philosophy would be totally different.
Right. Yeah, and it does seem to me that Western philosophy is often very weak on praxis. It's often very weak on having a yoga, right? In terms of some sort of practical sense of how, what do you do about it? How does it work? What's the system of transformation, which is where the Eastern sort of things seem to come in strongly.
That's true.
So you mentioned phenomenology, so kind of philosophy of experience, primacy of experience, and ontology, which, if I remember rightly, philosophy of being, right?
Yes.
Okay, so these are sort of two orientating positions or schools for you in this work?
Yes, like in my PhD, which I call the title of the PhD is Phenomenological Ontology of Breathing. So I'm doing phenomenological ontology. And first of all, phenomenology means, as you said, it's a return to phenomena as it appears to us in our experience. So it's always a return to our experiential life world, how we experience the world. And then especially in my PhD, I take the patron saint of philosophy of body, the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty's work. And I take he's famous for his phenomenology of perception and his phenomenology of the body. He has scattered like hints of what breathing could mean in phenomenology, and I take this in my PhD, and then I start to think what these descriptions of the breath could mean if they would be taken as a starting point of philosophical thinking. So first of all, what I do is I put aside or put out of play all scientific knowledge of the breath, because that's the only way you can get to phenomenology, because what natural sciences, for example, say of the breath is something that we don't experience, because the natural sciences say that the breath is in the first place gas exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen, and that it's the cells that need the oxygen, and it's in our brainstem the respiratory center that is in control of this breathing process and all this stuff.
Oh.
But in our experience, we experience none of that. We have never experienced cells. We have never experienced carbon dioxide or oxygen or our brains or the brainstem or a respiratory center there in the brainstem. So all this knowledge, which we normally take for granted, in phenomenological study you put aside, and then you start to only wonder what we have through our experience, in our experience. And that is the starting point of my philosophy. And then when it's the ontological work on breath, then I start to ask the questions connecting to the being of breathing, the existence of breathing, how our being is in the first place being in the world, and what does it mean that it's the experiential body's relation with the world that is like the ground of our being, and how the breath is the first connection there. That kind of stuff.
That kind of stuff, just casually at the end there, that kind of stuff, the phenomenal ontology of being, that kind of stuff. Okay, so if this is going over people's heads, and it's going over mine a little bit already, what have you discovered? What might be interesting for people here?
Well, what I have discovered is, in a certain sense, I have discovered a new way to do philosophy. That we should start to philosophize, to think the deep fundamental questions of life within atmosphere of experiential breathing. And it's like, in my view, it's like a possibility of attaining a certain kind of a respiratory revolution in our lives, so that everything that we have thought in different manners in philosophy and in sciences and in religion and so on, in our culture and different cultures, is that everything actually, all our questions, important questions of our life, could be re-examined, rethought, and re-experienced within the experience of breathing. And of course, in some of the Eastern traditions, as you mentioned, the breath has been important. But I would say that even they have not thought like questions of, or maybe they have, but because all the vocabulary needs to be translated into our Western languages, and also there is so much like layers in the Eastern thought of, like, let's say the word Atman, which is so important word in Hindu philosophy and in Upanishads and in other Indian philosophical systems. And it is even for the Indian tradition, it has been forgotten quite much that if we think of what Atman means, they say it's the inner soul, or the fundamental principle of life, or the immortal soul, or the great spirit, or whatever. But it is very often forgotten that Atman actually means, in the first place, breathing.
Okay, so I mean, can you give an example of this philosophy of breath, this philosophical breathing philosophy combinations? Give me an example about what that looks like.
Well, the first of all, I would say that what it looks like is that whatever question we are thinking, whatever philosophical question, we need to bring it back to our experience of breath. So, for example, if we start to think ethical questions, the questions of like, what is a good life?
Yeah.
Then this, we bring it to the question, if the breath is the certain kind of root or the source of our being and our way of being in the world and our relation to the atmosphere of air. So what would that mean if we start to think the questions of good life? So that would mean that we would, in the first place, would start to need to think, what does it mean that as a breathing beings who are all the time connected with this atmosphere, this invisible atmosphere through our breath, how we would connect the ethical questions, for example, the question of good life, into this kind of, how would I say, into this kind of field of respiratory thinking. So then it means this, that whatever we are thinking, we need to bring it back to questions of breath and start to think, what would it mean if we take seriously that we are in the first place breathing beings?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this is your philosophical breath work.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by embodied ethics as an idea. I studied ethics a little bit at the university as a sideline, just as I was doing psychology, but of all the sort of philosophical, the areas of philosophy, ethics, and, you know, what is the good life? What do we value? Or what should I fucking do when I get up in the morning? You know, like that always struck me as the most practical form of philosophy in many ways. It's like, okay, well, what's good? You know, what has value? And it's very interesting. I was doing a lot of martial arts at the time, and it was never, you know, they felt like I was doing this physical thing, and then, you know, seriously connect with ethics, and noticing in my body that I'd have ethical responses to things. You know, some things would take my breath away, some things would, you know, tighten my breath, some things would smoothen my breath when I did good things in a certain way. And yet that was just never talked about in any of the philosophy books I was reading. There was just zero on the body, yet it was ethics was very obviously a bodily experience for me. Some things opened my heart, some things made me contract, you know, and I saw almost nothing in the philosophy books that I read about the body.
Well, for example, when I said the ethics, and you said that it's the question of the body and connected with breathing, the ethical questions. One of the things that I have written about, and I gave also a presentation in Slovenia a few years ago, there was a hospitality conference, the hospitality of ethical hospitality, or hospitality of ethics. I gave a talk where, and then it later was published in one book about anthology on hospitality. And my article and my presentation was about the respiratory and aerial hospitality. So first, we have this idea that we welcome somebody with open arms into our house, and then this is as a form of hospitality. So the respiratory hospitality would mean that actually, if we would become conscious of it or aware, we are all the time welcoming with open lungs this invisible atmosphere of air, even if we wouldn't want to do it, but then we could do kind of a practice of it and make it consciously that when that invisible air that I don't know for certain what it is about, but I have to take it in me, it might have
profound trust in a way, isn't it? There's an act to breathe is an act of profound trust, and also it strikes me as profoundly intimate that normally, you know, to take something into your body, if you were to do that with a penis or, you know, some other bodily part, that's a tremendously intimate thing if someone put their tongue in your mouth or whatever, but we're literally taking something into us, this very intimate thing that's, and the other thing that always strikes me as very interesting is sort of self and other with breath. That it's like we have this as, well, I'm here and the world's there, but I have to keep taking in this thing from outside of the world into myself, you know, and then it becomes me. And equally, I'm continuously giving out. So there's a sense of trust in and kind of generosity out. You know, there's a way in which it also connects us to every single person, right? Like we're all breathing the same air. Like me and you, we're in different countries right now. But if I breathe out, that air is going into the same air that you're breathing.
Yes.
Does that make sense? Exactly. So there's this way, this is connecting quality to air, which I think doesn't exist. Like I can't touch you from another country, but I'm literally breathing into the air that you're breathing into and out of on a moment by moment basis.
Yeah, this is extremely important point that you're making here, and this is the how in a certain kind of mysterious connection we are all the time with other people. That air that was inside of you is now inside of somebody else, and there's a dog that is perhaps breathing that, and then you take that person's, and then there might be some smelling drunkard whose breath you are taking next in, and then there is the person that you hate might be in the same place, or somebody else that is just looking something that you would never want to talk or even touch. That person who has, for example, politically disgusting ideas from your point of view, or whatever that might be, still you are in a much, much more intimate connection with these people and these all other breathing beings. So it is a question of trust, and there comes a certain kind of way of which then comes to connection to this idea of hospitality, that could we learn totally different kind of way of opening ourselves to others who might think very differently than us, or might have nothing in common with us. So that also is one aspect of that ethical dimension of breathing. Then you mentioned trust, and trust is connected with also, you could think of in a certain way religious questions. So that would, if we would take that idea of respiratory trust, there I would suggest, when I say that all things could be rethought from the perspective of breathing, then we could start to think totally new way of thinking religion from as a kind of a respiratory religion.
Yeah, well, there's always been this connection of spirituality, like spirit as breath, breath as spirit, hasn't there?
Yes.
And I'll come back to religion. That feels like a thing to move towards. What about in a sort of COVID, post-COVID environment that, you know, people are being asked to cover their mouths, to not breathe on each other. I had a very interesting thing yesterday where I tried to talk to a stranger and they almost jumped back, you know, and I must have been, I was 2 or 3 meters away. I was quite far away, but they really jumped back. And it was like, don't breathe on me. That's deadly, you know, like this idea of the breath has become a weapon now. You know, you can, I heard in England, you can, if you think you have COVID and you cough on someone, you can be accused of attempted murder.
Really?
Yeah. So so if you think you have a COVID diagnosis and you're deliberately coughing on people, that is attempted murder. Very interesting. Now, I don't know if that's legally going to stand up, but I made a joke about this. I said, I'm just going to go around licking everyone. They're like, okay, you could actually be put in prison for that. So it's, what about this idea that breath has become dangerous in the modern age?
Yes, well, of course, this has been, in a certain way, atmosphere has been, you can think atmosphere, like this kind of atmospheric terrorism or atmo-terrorism, where you use already, it's not only in the first place the breath, but how whatever takes place in this invisible atmosphere of air where we don't see what kind of particles are moving there. As I was coming into that when there is this, that you need to breathe the air and you are kind of like your life depends on it. And then you don't know what this kind of unfamiliar breath is that same time is keeping you alive. And this was, of course, used, for example, when they were using poison gases in the First World War as this kind of atmospheric terrorism, or German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk has written about this. He calls it atmo-terrorism. And how to then...
Sloterdijk is his name. What a great name for someone studying death in the trenches. Sloterdijk. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and then how also in the Second World War, in the concentration camps, the gassing of the Jews was taking place. That was also taking place through the breath. So there is a long history, or there is a history of this kind of breath as a weapon, or the atmosphere as a weapon.
We tend to think of breath in terms of the best things, like it took my breath away. That woman was so beautiful, it took my breath away. But equally, the idea of strangling someone, gassing someone, I mean, these are some of the most repulsive things as well. So it seems to exist on us, if we talk aesthetics now rather than ethics as well, it seems to exist on an aesthetic spectrum, from the most horrific, ugly things human beings can do, on the moral end as well as the aesthetic end, but also we talk about it in regard to the most beautiful things, like you wouldn't share breath with someone deliberately unless you really liked them, like breathe in and out of each other's eyes, like CPR, bit gross, old person falls down in the street of a heart attack. Do you really want to do mouth to mouth? I mean, you will, I hope, out of duty, but you're not going to enjoy it, right? So it's like this, it has this kind of a very aesthetic range, you know what I mean, from the very ugly to the very beautiful.
Yes, and that brings to my mind what some of the early Christians were doing when you said the breath is spirit and spirit is breath. This idea, they had this kind of practice, or this kind of like connection that they called conspiratio. So originally the word conspiration means, like, in a certain way could say respiration is always conspiration, because conspiration or conspiracy doesn't mean what we nowadays talk about, conspiracy theories and stuff like this, but it meant breathing together. Because that
the Maori greeting where you take a breath together, that's
yes, so
noses, yeah.
Exactly. So there is an interpretation, or there is a theory that the early Christians, when, for example, in the Gospel of John, it is said that Jesus breathed the Holy Spirit to the disciples, that there was actually this practice that connected in the most deep sense all the followers of Jesus together, was that they were blowing breath into each other's mouth as the practice of sharing the Spirit, because the Holy Spirit, the Greek word is pneuma, which means at the same time spirit and breath.
Yes. And a few other languages too, you'll see that connection in Hebrew, I think it might be as well. And that's very interesting. So there's almost a lineage transmission, isn't there? It's like you're being breathed on by someone who was breathed on by Jesus or something,
Exactly.
This kind of piece, there's a transmission piece there, yeah. So,
but then when the Black Death came, then people
that went out of fashion.
That was the greatest idea.
That went out of fashion. Those guys died off pretty quick. So actually, breaking aside,
you forget that. The Christianity forget that, the whole thing.
We can't go rid of that one. I worry about a world where we're scared of breath. It disturbed me. There's something about this young woman who stepped back yesterday away from me, where I thought, I worry that that's becoming a norm now. That it's, in the same way as like I wouldn't call what happened in the trenches terrorism. I just call that war, breath war. But I mean, now it's almost like, okay, is this without going to conspiracy theory kind of, conspiracy, we'll bring that in again. But it seems to me this making us afraid of each other's breath is a very primary thing, whether it's justified or not. That's a very primary thing to install in a global populace. A global population. I was on a plane recently, and for the first time in ages, and people were like scared to breathe because they didn't want to breathe, but you can't not breathe, right? It's like you could not touch, you could not eat for a little bit, you could not drink the water for a few days, but you can't not breathe.
Yeah, I mean, if this goes on, this kind of afraidness of and the fear of breath because of COVID or something else, it's gonna totally transform our way of being, and I really hope that it's not going toward that kind of direction.
Yeah. There's a dehumanizing quality, a disconnecting quality as well in that. Yeah. Okay, you sort of touched upon spirituality earlier, and we've come to this sort of words that have similar meanings, and the breath of life and this. What's your definition of spirituality in regard to breath then?
Well, I take very literally and very seriously this idea that spirituality and the word spirit, the first of the Greek word pneuma, for example, in the Bible, that it was translated in all the Bibles as spirit. I think that's a huge problem, and I would suggest that all Bibles should be retranslated mostly, and every time in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, where Jesus is speaking, I would say that the word pneuma should be translated as breath. And then that was translated to the Latin Bible Vulgate, where still there was the word pneuma was translated to spiritus. And that word spiritus, of course, then meant breath and it meant spirit, how we then understand it now. And that came from the Latin verb spirare, which means to breathe. So all the spiritual practices and what is called a spirituality, when we talk about spiritual practices, for example, you mentioned before we started to record this that you have practiced aikido. And aikido, of course, has been understood as a spiritual practice in a certain way. And in aikido, for example, the breath is extremely important. And the word ki there can be understood as breath in a certain sense. So the thing I would say that my understanding of spirituality is that everything can become a spiritual practice if that practice, where there is certain kind of movement or certain kind of way of doing things, is always following the breath. Because normally what we do, our breath is following, for example, in athletics, the runner or the running makes it, and then the breath becomes panting and becomes faster and so on. So in a spiritual practice, whatever you are doing, it is the breath that you are listening all the time, and all the movements are following and in accordance with the breath. And that would then make a certain practice or exercise spiritual, in my view, if the word spiritual practice is really taken seriously in its original meaning.
Wonderful. I'm just sort of working my way through sort of, Holy Spirit and things like this, lots of translations and things. So, yeah, I mean, people often ask me what I would regard as an embodiment practice. And I say, well, is there body awareness and is there breath? Often they're the things that I point to just immediately. It's kind of as requirements. Okay. What do you think most people are missing about the breath in not thinking about it philosophically, not going as deeply into it as you have? I mean, what are some of the sort of things that you think people are missing that are to you maybe now obvious?
Well, they are missing that breath is connected to everything we do. We are normally connected to some of the things that we do. For example, if we do yoga or aikido or some other spiritual practices or martial arts or stuff like this. But I would say that there is actually a respiratory meaning in everything that we do, even for those things that we never connect with the breath. Because how I claim this, or how I try to argue this is that if you hold your nose and you hold your breath and you start to hold it and you try to do anything that you do in your normal life, whatever that is, and you try to do it by holding your breath and see what happens, how fast it becomes totally meaningless what you're actually doing, because the only thing you're thinking is how I could breathe again. I'm starting to feel really dreadful and anxious and so on. So that means that there is some kind of secret respiratory meaning in everything that we do, even if we don't connect it ever with the breath. And that's kind of part of my philosophy of breathing, is to start to think, what could be those secret meanings?
Yeah, I would say that about the body more generally. People sometimes say to me, well, how's the body involved? And I'm like, well, if you do this with your body, it's going to change it. If you can optimize your thinking, your social interaction, your expression, it's involved with everything you do. Wherever you go, your body's there. It's impacting things. It's just a matter of, do you know if it's happening? Can you control it? Can you influence it? Or is it happening to you without you knowing it? I'm wondering what the breath pattern was like of every single philosopher. I'm imagining Nietzsche, having this like crazy ragged breath pattern, or I'm imagining sort of Socrates having having his kind of long out breath, kind of easygoing or whatever. Like, it would be kind of a fun thing to sort of imagine the breath patterns, all these different thinkers who thought that their thinking was independent of their bodies.
I think that would be absolutely fascinating. And nowadays it would be also important to little bit be following what kind of breathing patterns these current philosophers have, and to start to think that could we see perhaps something why they emphasize certain questions because of their breath. And
nice. I want to be that way as well, right? Like, if your philosophy is embodied in manner X, do I want to take on your philosophy by the fruits of it that are being shown in your breath? Sometimes maybe not. Sometimes I kind of see people and go, wow, that's your embodiment. Whatever you're thinking, I don't want it in my head.
Exactly.
Like there's a sign that's being given to me of like, maybe keep away from this guy, before I hear one word of their philosophy.
That's exactly, Mark. So the thing is, like, what in this ontology that we wrote called Atmospheres of Breathing, one of the key points in our introduction is that we take the Nobel Prize winner of literature, Elias Canetti's, this aphorism very seriously and start to think what it means, because he says that it is not enough to think, one also has to breathe. And then comes the important sentence: dangerous are the thinkers who have not breathed enough.
Ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth? Yeah, it's definitely a sign for me if people, and I'm not expecting people to be athletic, for example, but I want to see a vibrancy. I want to hear a kindness in their breath, not like Darth Vader breathing. That's, this kind of thing. It's like, as soon as you hear Darth Vader, he's a bad guy from the breath, right? It's like, come on, pay attention. This is obvious.
Well, yeah, and then when you said this, like, for example, if everybody starts to walk in this kind of COVID masks all the time, will it start to make us a little bit like Darth Vader as all? That's a kind of a question which I think is worth of thinking.
Worth thinking about, for sure. Worth thinking about it. I'm imagining this really blows the minds of philosophy students. If you were doing a lecture at a university and you're like, okay, how does Heidegger breathe? No one fucking knows, of course, because no one understands Heidegger. But it's like that must blow the minds of academics to be even given that question. You know what I mean? Like, that's just not a question that was ever proposed to me in the philosophy department at the university I was at.
Well, this has been for many of my colleagues quite a very strange thing that what I'm doing, this philosophy of breathing. And jokingly, one of my colleagues asked me once when we were having a dinner, he asked, why are you doing this thing? Why you could also doing a philosophy of farting?
Wow.
So even if that's a joke, normally jokes tell something truth in them. So that you can't like make both is kind of passing gas in a certain way, from the other from the mouth and some from the other from behind. But the thing is like that, okay, there is a huge difference between farting and breathing.
It's a way of belittling the body. You know, I had a friend of mine who was actually an anthropologist at university, and he just said, look, my body just carries my head from one lecture to the next, you know. And this was a guy who had like physical health problems by the age of 30. I was like, dude, maybe there's a reason why you're having physical health problems. You're only 30 years old and you're having all these health conditions, and it's like you just view your body as this sort of brain taxi servant of yours. It just like, come on, dude. Like, and he'd been really bought into the whole academic model, and his health was really suffering as far as I could see. Okay, well, we've covered most things here. I'm just looking through the questions you sent me. There's one neologism here, mindfunfulness. What is mindfunfulness? You sent me that. I was curious.
Yes, I did. And I'm happy that you asked me from it, because that will also, I'm now doing my, I have a YouTube channel which is called Mindfunfulness, and I will soon have a web page which will be called mindfunfulness.com and so on. So what is mindfunfulness? Mindfunfulness is I'm putting together, of course, two words, mindfulness and fun. And of course, nowadays, so many people are talking about mindfulness practices and connected with certain kind of meditative practices as mindfulness and so on. And most of the mindfulness practices start with certain kind of connection with the breath. We start to become mindful of breathing. And then people are thinking that they are doing something spiritual. And when they are doing something spiritual, they start to think that they are doing something serious. And for me, true spirituality is always something to do with fun, something to do with playfulness. That if you are truly spiritual and your breath is alive, your body is alive, there is always something playful and fun in your whole way of existing. And so this is my kind of putting together these two words, fun and mindfulness, and starting to think that how you could, because I've been practicing mindfulness meditation for many years, but then I connected with laughing with it, for example, that you go into mindfulness breathing and you just let the breath, you follow the breath, and then suddenly you burst into laughter while you are still doing the meditation. And you laugh for some minutes, then you go back to your mindfulness meditation, and then you start to laugh again and you go back to your mindfulness meditation. And how you could start to think that they become intertwined, the laughing and the mindfulness meditation. And is it possible that this awareness that you are being aware of your breath, this consciousness, could it be that the quality of that consciousness, the quality of that awareness would start to change? It would start to become certain kind of laughing awareness. And then you wouldn't be anymore being aware of the breath and following the breath in this kind of serious awareness, but it would become kind of a playful act of like that your conscious would be totally different when it is following the breath, and it's in accordance with the breath when you are doing the laughing with it. And the laughing itself is, of course, one way of breathing. It's one of the greatest
breathing pattern. It's an interesting breathing pattern. Yeah.
It's one of the greatest ways to practice your diaphragm is laughing.
Okay, releasing the diaphragm. I always find the breathing patterns of eroticism and laughter, grief, these things all have quite specific breathing patterns that are nothing.
And also, like, if I can still continue a few things, it is important to remember, of course, the mindfulness practices of mindfulness of breathing comes from the Buddhist tradition. And in the Chinese and Japanese Zen tradition, there has always been these monks who have been laughing Buddhas. There are stories of these monks who come to the marketplace and the only thing they start to do is laugh. And they are laughing and laughing. People gather around them and everybody's laughing together. And this is kind of a spiritual practice. And then your mind will... And then I want to say another thing, because I'm so much fascinated by stand-up comedy.
Me too. So, go on.
And I love the greatest comedians. I think they are truly deep thinkers as well. And so the whole idea of deep thinking and insightful thinking needs always jokes. It needs always laughing. For example, if you take stand-up comedy of George Carlin or Bill Hicks or Doug Stanhope, all my
Great
heroes.
favorites. I have some jokes about Finnish people. So there's
Tell
two
me.
Finnish guys standing in a bar. They've been there for an hour in complete silence. One says to the other after an hour, eventually they've had 3 beers. He looks at him and says, "How are you doing?" And his friend turns back to him and said, "Do we come here to drink or to talk?"
Yes, this. All the Finns tell this to all the foreigners. I have heard this like maybe a million times.
I'm sorry, but it's cliches. But there is a glint and twinkle in the eye of Finns. It's a little bit different than Scandinavians that you often get confused with. There's definitely something, as a sparkle, a cheekiness, a humour underneath the quiet weirdness, and I never quite understood it. There's something alien about Finnish people. Like I suspect you're from another planet, actually, because you're not the same as the Swedes, or I mean, the Russians have their things going on the other side, but the Finns, you're quite particular, aren't you?
We are. Yes. Now you took the genie out of the bottle. We are actually aliens. We were.
I knew it. That language as well. Beautiful language, but where the fuck did that come from? What a language.
Did you know that J.R. Tolkien was absolutely fascinated by the Finnish language? And for example, some of the Elven languages were inspired. Tolkien was hugely inspired by the Finnish language. And
Elvish, I'm totally sure about that, for sure. That does not surprise me in any way. It
and
is
also,
an unusual language.
The magician Gandalf was very much inspired by Finnish mythology of Kalevala and their greatest hero Väinämöinen.
Okay, and there is a magic quality to the Finnish. I don't quite understand what it is. There's a little bit of smile, fun, cheekiness, and a little bit of magic, and a lot of darkness too. Apparently, you have the most death metal bands per 1,000 people of the population.
That's true.
There's the darkness, and there's a few things going on. I don't pretend to understand it, but I do like it. Okay, so Kitos, let me say thank you, appreciative. Where do people find you online? Where do people go to check out your stuff here? Where's a good place to go?
Well, as I said, just maybe in a week, I don't know when this will come online.
A month at least a month, yeah.
Okay, so very soon I will be online my new webpage called www. How many doubles you asked? The 3 W's.
Why not? 3 is good.
Yeah, mindfunfulness.com will be my website, and then if you can find my Instagram is Mindfunfulness. I haven't been very active there, but maybe I should start. And then you should go to my YouTube channel. Mindfunfulness is the name of the YouTube channel. And then if you check in YouTube, for example, Petri Berndtson, my name, you will find, I think there is now 4 before this, like an hour-long interviews about philosophy of breathing.
Okay, well, there's definitely a few ways to check you out. I just added you on Instagram there, so it looks like we're Instagram friends now. This has been really fun. I'm a bit wiped out.
I will show also this. This is the book that I was talking about.
What's it called? Atmospheres of Breathing.
So this is the first, 2018, came from SUNY Press. It's the first anthology ever to be published on philosophy of breathing. And then if somebody wants to read my PhD, you can get it for free, the PDF version, if you type Google Phenomenology of Phenomenological ontology of breathing. It's the first thing that comes, and check it out.
You are better at promoting yourself than most Finnish people, any Finnish person I've ever met, actually. Did you live in America or something? Like, how did you learn this skill?
Well, actually, you are correct on this. When I was 10 years old, I lived for half a year. Then I have been living many places. I lived in Greece for 5 years. I lived in New Zealand. I lived in Holland, and so on. And then the thing is, like, I always thought that I'm not really Finnish. I happen to be born in a Finnish family, and I talk a lot with my hands, and I am loud and so on. So I always connected somehow that I'm a strange Italian who just happened to be born
Italian in a Finnish person's body. Oh my God, I don't know what I am, but yeah, I like it. Okay, so I'll give you a shout if I'm in Helsinki. I do plan to visit on one day. I've never actually been to Helsinki. I've only been to the north of Finland, so I would like to visit one day. So if you're ever in London or Brighton, give me a shout. We'll give you an invite to the Embodiment Conference if you want to share your stuff there, because I think it's very cool. I've enjoyed very much talking to a philosopher. It's not every day for me, and I did have a side interest in that back in the day. So it's nice to talk to a philosopher. Do you have a closing message about the breath for all our listeners?
Okay, the closing message of the breath is what I already said, but I will tell my motto again. All things and phenomena of life need to be rethought, re-examined, and re-experienced within the experiential atmosphere of breathing, and then everything will change. It's going to be a certain kind of respiratory revolution.
Boom, boom, boom. I like it. This has been a lot of fun. You've energized me. I'm going to take a quick break for my next interview. So, Sir Kitos, again, thank you so much.
This was so much fun.
Good. Stay in touch. It has been fun. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.